Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
Tracy Quartermaine has never been a woman who takes things lightly, nor does she ever back down from the truth when it rears its ugly head. She has faced heartbreak, betrayal, and lies for decades, yet somehow she always manages to stand tall with her signature sarcasm and steel backbone. But what she stumbled upon recently shook her to the core in ways that even she could not have anticipated. The revelation about Ronnie, someone she never fully trusted yet still underestimated, changed everything in her world. For weeks, Tracy had suspected something was off. The subtle glances, the half-hearted excuses, and the vague answers had started to gnaw at her sharp instincts. Tracy knew deception when she saw it, and Ronnie was practically dripping in it. Yet what she never expected was the magnitude of the secret he had been hiding, one that would not only affect her but ripple across Port Charles like a bomb exploding in slow motion. It all began on one of those evenings when the Quartermaine mansion seemed quieter than usual, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tracy had returned home later than expected, carrying the weight of an exhausting day filled with family drama. She had intended to pour herself a stiff drink, retreat upstairs, and lock the chaos out of her room for just a little while. But the night had other plans. As she passed through the hallways, she overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Ronnie's voice, low but urgent, filtered through the half-open study door. The tone was enough to stop her in her tracks. She wasn't exactly eavesdropping, she told herself, merely exercising her natural curiosity, a trait that had saved her more times than she could count. What she heard made her blood run cold. Words like cover-up, dangerous, and no one can find out were muttered with a panic that Ronnie rarely let slip. In that moment, Tracy realized that whatever game Ronnie was playing, it was darker than she had ever suspected. For the next few days, Tracy couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. She tried to go about her usual routines, bickering with family members, throwing in her biting one-liners, and maintaining the image of control that everyone expected of her. But beneath it all, her mind kept circling back to Ronnie. What was he hiding? Who was he protecting, or worse, who was he hurting? The unanswered questions burrowed into her like thorns. Tracy had never been one to let unanswered questions fester for long, especially not when she could take matters into her own hands. So she did what Tracy Quartermaine does best, she started digging. Quietly, carefully, but with razor-sharp precision, she began pulling at the threads of Ronnie's life, looking for the loose end that would unravel everything. It didn't take long before she found herself staring at something she almost wished she hadn't. A folder tucked away in a drawer in the Quartermaine study, hidden behind stacks of unimportant paperwork, practically screamed for her attention. Normally, Tracy would never stoop to rummaging through someone else's belongings in such a direct way, but something about the moment felt fated. Her instincts pushed her forward. She opened the folder, her sharp eyes scanning through its contents, and what she read left her stunned. Bank transactions that didn't add up, coded messages that hinted at illegal dealings, and most damning of all, a photograph that connected Ronnie to someone deeply entrenched in organized crime. Tracy felt the room tilt for a moment, her usually steady composure shaken. Ronnie wasn't just hiding a personal failing or some embarrassing misstep. He was entangled in something dangerous, something that could put everyone in Port Charles at risk. Tracy clutched the folder tightly, her mind racing with the implications. If she confronted Ronnie outright, he would deny it and possibly destroy any evidence before she could act. If she went to the police, she risked putting herself and her family in jeopardy, not to mention the possibility that no one would believe her without proof. It was a delicate balance between caution and action, and for once, Tracy felt the weight of indecision pressing down on her. But as quickly as the fear crept in, her Quartermaine pride shoved it aside. She wasn't about to let Ronnie pull the wool over everyone's eyes. Not this time. Tracy was determined to get to the bottom of his deception, no matter how far down the rabbit hole she had to go. The next encounter with Ronnie was tense, to say the least. Tracy could barely keep her disdain under wraps as she watched him charm his way through conversations, pretending as though nothing was amiss. Every smile, every offhand joke, every casual comment felt like a slap in the face now that she knew what lurked beneath the surface. Ronnie, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Tracy, carried on as though the world belonged to him. But Tracy's sharp glares and cutting remarks didn't go unnoticed. Ronnie began to sense that something had shifted, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. And that was exactly how Tracy wanted it. She needed him off balance, unsure, and vulnerable. If she was going to expose him, she needed the upper hand. Late one night, Tracy found herself unable to sleep. The folder haunted her, sitting hidden in her own room now, its contents like a ticking time bomb. She poured herself a drink and sat by the window, staring out into the night sky, wondering how she had gotten pulled into such a mess. Part of her wanted to hand everything over to someone else, let the police, or even Sonny Corinthos, deal with Ronnie and his mess. But another part of her, the part that thrived on control and power, knew she couldn't just walk away. This was personal now. Ronnie had lied to her face, put her family at risk, and underestimated her intelligence. That was a mistake he was going to regret. The following days were a test of Tracy's patience, something she never had much of to begin with. Every time she crossed paths with Ronnie, she found herself fighting the urge to throw the damning folder in his face and demand answers. But timing was everything. If she showed her hand too soon, he'd cover his tracks. Ronnie was slippery, the kind of man who always had an excuse ready, and Tracy knew he wouldn't hesitate to gaslight her or turn the tables if she wasn't careful. Still, she couldn't ignore the gnawing anger that burned inside her. Ronnie wasn't just sneaky, he was dangerous. And he had chosen the wrong woman to deceive. Her suspicions were confirmed one afternoon when she followed him discreetly out of the mansion. Tracy prided herself on her ability to blend in when she wanted to, despite her sharp presence. She tailed him through Port Charles, keeping her distance as he darted into less traveled streets, far from the usual upscale spots he pretended to frequent. Ronnie thought he was clever, checking over his shoulder now and then, but Tracy knew the art of surveillance better than most. She had lived through enough betrayals to recognize the subtle signs of a man trying to cover his trail. When he slipped into a dingy warehouse on the edge of town, Tracy's suspicions hardened into certainty. Whatever he was mixed up in wasn't legal, and it wasn't something that could be brushed under the rug. From the shadows, Tracy watched as Ronnie met with two men whose faces were hard and unforgiving, the type of men she recognized from past encounters with the criminal underbelly of Port Charles. Their body language was tense, their gestures curt, and though she couldn't hear the entire conversation, she picked up enough words to piece together the truth. Shipment, money, and don't get caught were the key phrases that reached her ears. Her pulse quickened as the reality sank in. Ronnie wasn't just dabbling in shady business, he was actively running operations that could spiral into something catastrophic. The Quartermaines had dealt with scandal before, but this was a threat on an entirely different scale. Tracy's mind raced with possibilities as she carefully withdrew from the warehouse scene. She knew she couldn't take this evidence to the family yet, not without causing panic or tipping off Ronnie. Ned, for example, would demand action, and Brooke Lynn would likely rush into a confrontation without thinking. Tracy couldn't risk putting them in danger. For now, this was her battle to fight. She tucked the information away, her resolve strengthening with every step she took back toward the mansion. If Ronnie thought he could keep her in the dark, he was gravely mistaken. Tracy had a plan forming, and once she set it in motion, there would be no turning back. When she returned home that night, she found Ronnie waiting in the living room, lounging in one of the chairs with that smug grin he always wore. His eyes lingered on her a second too long, and Tracy knew he suspected something. "Long day?" he asked casually, swirling the drink in his hand as though nothing were amiss. Tracy forced a smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and sat opposite him. "Long enough," she replied, her tone laced with deliberate ambiguity. The silence that followed was thick, a silent war of wills. Ronnie was testing her, and she was testing him right back. Neither one broke eye contact, and in that moment, Tracy knew this was only the beginning of their deadly game of cat and mouse. The tension escalated in the days that followed. Ronnie began hovering more than usual, asking too many questions about where Tracy was going, who she was seeing, and what she was doing with her time. On the surface, it came across as idle curiosity, maybe even charm, but Tracy could see through the act. He was nervous. He was trying to figure out if she knew something, and that alone confirmed to her that she was on the right path. Tracy, never one to be underestimated, gave him just enough half-truths to keep him guessing. She wasn't about to tip her hand until she had all the leverage she needed. Her chance came sooner than expected. One evening, while most of the Quartermaines were distracted by a family dinner that had spiraled into chaos, as they so often did, Tracy slipped into Ronnie's room. She hated lowering herself to snooping, but desperate times called for desperate measures. What she found confirmed everything. A locked briefcase tucked under his bed was filled with stacks of untraceable cash, small weapons, and more documents tying him to organized crime. Tracy's heart pounded as she carefully examined each piece, memorizing as much as she could before locking it back up and returning it to its hiding place. She knew now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Ronnie was dangerous. And she also knew he wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who uncovered the truth. That realization shook her more than she wanted to admit. Alone in her room later that night, Tracy found herself grappling with emotions she rarely allowed to surface, fear and vulnerability. It wasn't like her to doubt her own strength, but the stakes were higher than ever. If Ronnie discovered how much she knew, he could lash out in ways that put not just her but everyone she loved at risk. For a moment, she wondered if she was in over her head. But then, as always, her pride and resilience kicked in. Tracy Quartermaine had survived too much to let one man intimidate her into silence. No matter how dark Ronnie's secret was, she was going to expose it. She owed it to herself, her family, and the city she had called home all her life. The next morning, Tracy awoke with a clear plan forming in her mind. She needed an ally, someone who could help her bring Ronnie down without attracting too much attention. Her first instinct was to approach Anna Devane, someone who had dealt with more criminals than she could count and who would immediately grasp the gravity of the situation. But Tracy hesitated. Going to Anna meant handing over control, and Tracy wasn't ready to give that up. Instead, she considered looping in someone closer to the family orbit, someone who would have just as much incentive to protect the Quartermaines as she did. Ned was a possibility, but he was already burdened with family responsibilities. Brooklyn was too impulsive. Then, a thought struck her, what about Sonny? He wasn't exactly family, but he had a long history of protecting Port Charles from dangerous figures like Ronnie. And, ironically enough, Sonny was someone who would recognize a liar and a schemer immediately. Still, the idea of allying herself with Sonny Corinthos made Tracy uneasy. She had never been his biggest fan, and the thought of owing him a favor was distasteful. But desperate times called for desperate measures. As she mulled over her options, Tracy knew one thing for certain, she couldn't take Ronnie down alone. He was too clever, too connected, and too ruthless. If she made the wrong move, the fallout could be catastrophic. That night, Tracy stared at her reflection in the mirror, her face set with determination. She had uncovered Ronnie's terrible secret, but now came the hardest part, deciding how to use it. One false step and the Quartermaines could be dragged into a scandal that would haunt them for years. But if she played her cards right, she could not only protect her family but also make sure Ronnie paid for every lie, every deception, and every dangerous game he had played. Tracy Quartermaine had faced countless battles before, but this one felt different. This one was personal. And Ronnie had no idea just how formidable his opponent truly was. Tracy's decision weighed on her heavily over the next several days. Every time she saw Ronnie strutting around the mansion with that arrogant swagger, she had to restrain herself from blurting out that she knew everything. But restraint had always been her strength, even if her family rarely gave her credit for it. Beneath the sharp tongue and withering glares was a woman who played the long game better than most. Tracy had survived decades of Quartermaine chaos because she understood timing. And she knew her timing with Ronnie had to be precise. She wasn't dealing with some bumbling fool, this was a man deeply entangled in crime, a man who wouldn't hesitate to strike if he felt cornered. She couldn't afford a misstep. Her growing unease only sharpened when she began noticing small things around the mansion. Items moved, drawers slightly ajar, and once, a faint impression in the carpet outside her bedroom door as if someone had been standing there in the middle of the night. Ronnie was starting to suspect her. Tracy's gut told her he might even be testing her, trying to figure out if she had discovered anything. That meant her window of opportunity was closing fast. If she waited too long, she'd lose her advantage. And if Ronnie struck first, she might not get another chance. One evening, as she sat in the drawing room pretending to read, she caught him watching her. His eyes lingered a moment too long, studying her with a calculating intensity. The smirk that played across his lips sent a chill down her spine. "You've been quiet lately," he remarked, his voice deceptively light. "That's not like you, Tracy. Should I be worried?" She looked up from her book, meeting his gaze with the kind of icy stare that had withered far tougher men than him. "If I wanted you worried, Ronnie," she said coolly, "trust me, you'd know." The words hung between them like a drawn sword, and for the briefest flicker of a second, she saw his composure crack. He knew she was onto him, even if he didn't yet know how much she had uncovered. That night, Tracy found herself pacing her bedroom, her nerves stretched taut. She couldn't sit idly by any longer. Ronnie was becoming bolder, and every moment she delayed gave him more room to tighten his grip. Finally, she made her decision. She would meet with Sonny Corinthos. The thought still left a bitter taste in her mouth, but Tracy was pragmatic above all else. Sonny understood men like Ronnie, and more importantly, he had the means to neutralize him without dragging the Quartermain name through the mud. If Tracy was going to pull this off, she needed an ally who could move in shadows where she could not. The following day, Tracy arranged for a chance encounter with Sonny at Charlie's pub. She hated lowering herself to asking for help, but as she slid into the booth across from him, she masked her distaste with her usual veneer of composure. Sonny raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her presence. "This is unexpected," he said, his tone cautious. "What brings you here, Tracy?" She leaned in, her voice low and measured. "I need your help. And believe me, I wouldn't be here if it weren't serious." The words caught his attention immediately. Sonny had always respected Tracy's sharpness, even if they were rarely on the same side. For her to seek him out meant something was gravely wrong. She carefully laid out the situation, never revealing the full extent of what she knew but giving Sonny enough to understand the danger. Ronnie was tied to organized crime, she explained, and he had brought his poison into the Quartermain home. Sonny's expression hardened as he listened, his jaw tightening. "You're telling me this guy's running operations out of your mansion?" he asked, his voice low but deadly serious. Tracy nodded, her eyes burning with fury. "He thinks he can use us as cover. But I won't let him drag my family name through the mud. Not again." There was steel in her voice, the kind Sonny recognized. He leaned back, studying her for a moment, before giving a slow nod. "All right, Tracy. If what you're saying is true, then we've got a problem. And I'll help you take care of it. But once we start this, there's no going back." As she left the meeting, Tracy felt the smallest flicker of relief. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't carrying the burden alone. But she also knew what Sonny's warning meant. There would be no half measures, no room for hesitation. Once they set things in motion, Ronnie would either go down, or he'd take someone with him. That night, Tracy lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the times she had fought to protect the Quartermain legacy. She had faced manipulative husbands, scheming relatives, and greedy opportunists. But Ronnie was different. He was a threat that could burn everything to the ground if she didn't stop him. And she would stop him, no matter the cost. The very next day, she got her first taste of how dangerous Ronnie truly was. She returned to the mansion to find her room ransacked. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered, personal belongings tossed carelessly across the floor. Whoever had done it had been looking for something. Tracy's chest tightened as she realized what it meant. Ronnie knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to suspect she had evidence against him. As she stood in the wreckage of her room, she felt her resolve harden like steel. He wanted to intimidate her, to make her back down. But all he had done was prove how desperate he was to keep his secret buried. And desperation made people sloppy. That would be his downfall. When she confronted Ronnie later, he played innocent, of course. "Looks like you've got some clumsy help around here," he said with a smirk, feigning sympathy. "You should really hire better staff." Tracy met his gaze, her face cold, her words laced with venom. "Careful, Ronnie. You're underestimating me. And that's always a mistake." For a moment, the smirk faltered, and she knew she had struck a nerve. He was trying to rattle her, but Tracy Quartermain didn't rattle easily. If anything, the game had only fueled her determination to bring him down once and for all. Later that evening, Tracy called Sonny again. Her voice was firm, her decision made. "It's time," she told him. "We need to move before he realizes just how much I know." Sonny's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Then finally, he said, "All right. We'll take him down. But you need to be careful, Tracy. Men like him, they don't go quietly." Tracy's lips curved into a cold smile. "Neither do I." The air inside the Quartermain mansion was unusually still, as if even the walls were bracing themselves for the storm that was about to break. Tracy moved through the halls with a calmness that belied the pounding of her heart. Every step, every glance over her shoulder reminded her that she was playing with fire. Ronnie had already proven how dangerous he was. But Tracy was not a woman to back down when her family's honor was at stake. She had called Sonny earlier that morning, and the plan was set. By the end of the day, Ronnie's empire of lies would begin to crumble. She found Ronnie in the study, leaning casually against the desk with that same insufferable smirk plastered on his face. His charm was hollow now, stripped bare by the weight of what she knew. He looked at her as though he already suspected she was about to make her move. "You've been awfully busy lately," he said, his voice slick with mockery. "Care to share what you've been up to?" Tracy raised her chin, meeting his gaze with a sharpness that could cut glass. "You should know better than anyone, Ronnie," she said coolly. "Secrets never stay buried forever." The flicker in his eyes told her she'd struck the nerve she intended. For the first time, Ronnie seemed unsure, as though realizing just how much ground he had lost. By nightfall, Sonny had set everything in motion. His men had eyes on the warehouse where Ronnie had conducted his shady business, and the police were quietly alerted. Tracy had insisted on being there when the hammer finally fell, though Sonny had warned her it was risky. "You're not bulletproof, Tracy," he reminded her as they met in the shadows near the docks. She gave him a look that carried decades of Quartermain pride. "Neither are you, Sonny. But that's never stopped you before." He couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. Tracy Quartermain was fearless, and in that moment, he respected her more than he ever had. The trap was simple, but effective. Ronnie thought he was meeting with his associates for a final exchange, unaware that Sonny and his men had infiltrated the entire operation. Tracy stayed close but out of sight, her pulse hammering as she watched Ronnie stride into the warehouse like he owned the world. His confidence made her stomach turn. How many lives had he ruined with his schemes? How many people had he hurt to protect his own skin? But as he started barking orders, the walls closed in. Sonny's men stepped out from the shadows, weapons raised, and the police surged in moments later. The look on Ronnie's face was priceless, shock, fury, and fear all tangled together. "Tracy," he snarled when he saw her step out from behind Sonny, her eyes cold and unflinching. "You did this." She met his gaze without flinching. "You brought this on yourself, Ronnie. You thought you could use my family as a shield for your crimes. You thought you could manipulate me. But you underestimated me, and that's always a mistake." Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of a woman who had waited her entire life for moments like this, moments where truth and justice finally collided. Ronnie lunged, desperate and reckless, but Sonny's men had him restrained within seconds. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place was like a final exclamation point to Tracy's battle. She stood tall, unshaken, even as Ronnie shouted threats. "This isn't over. You'll regret this, Tracy." His words rang hollow, drowned out by the sound of the police reading him his rights. She watched him being dragged away, a sense of grim satisfaction settling in her chest. For weeks, she had carried the weight of his secret, and now the burden was lifted. Ronnie's reign of deceit was over. Later that night, back at the mansion, Tracy poured herself a drink and sat in the drawing room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The house was quiet again, the chaos of the evening fading into the silence. She knew her family would have questions, and there would no doubt be fallout from the scandal once word spread through Port Charles. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She had faced Ronnie head-on, uncovered his terrible secret, and ensured he would no longer pose a threat. It had come at a cost, her nerves were frayed, her trust shaken, but Tracy had emerged victorious. Sonny stopped by briefly to check in. He stood in the doorway, his expression serious but tinged with admiration. "You did good, Tracy," he said simply. She looked at him, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "Don't sound so surprised, Sonny. I always do." He chuckled softly, shaking his head before leaving her to her solitude. Alone once more, Tracy raised her glass in a quiet toast to herself. The Quartermaine name had survived another scandal, and Ronnie's secret was buried where it belonged, in the past. But even as she savored the victory, Tracy knew better than to let her guard down completely. Port Charles was never quiet for long, and every triumph seemed to pave the way for a new challenge. Still, she had proven once again that she was no one's fool, and certainly no one's victim. Ronnie had thought he could outsmart her, but Tracy Quartermaine had shown him, and everyone else, that she was always one step ahead. And as she drained her glass and set it down with a decisive clink, she allowed herself one final thought. Whatever storm came next, she would be ready. Because Tracy Quartermaine always was. The night of the takedown carried an electricity that Tracy hadn't felt in years. Every nerve in her body was on edge as she waited near the docks, the cold air nipping at her skin, but her eyes never wavering from the warehouse where Ronnie thought his future was secure. She had lived through countless battles, personal and professional, but this felt different. This was no ordinary Quartermaine squabble or a petty family scandal. This was life and death, power and survival. And this time, she was the one pulling the strings. Ronnie arrived late, as if to remind everyone that he believed himself untouchable. The sight of him swaggering into the warehouse with his usual self-satisfied grin churned Tracy's stomach. She could almost hear his thoughts, his certainty that no one could outsmart him. But she had. For weeks, she had played her cards with precision, hiding her knowledge, keeping her composure, waiting for the perfect moment. Now, as Sonny's men moved into position and the police closed in quietly around the perimeter, Tracy finally allowed herself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. The trap was about to spring. Inside, Ronnie barked orders to his associates, shoving crates open and checking cash bundles with the greed of a man too confident in his own power. He didn't notice the shift in the room at first, the subtle tension, the sudden silence as Sonny stepped from the shadows, his men flanking him. By the time Ronnie realized what was happening, it was too late. The doors slammed shut, the police rushed in, and his empire crumbled in a matter of seconds. "What the hell is this?" Ronnie roared, his face twisting with fury. He spun, his eyes locking on Tracy, who emerged slowly from behind Sonny. For the first time, the smug mask slipped from his face, replaced by pure disbelief. "You," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "You betrayed me." Tracy's lips curved into the coldest of smiles, her eyes glittering with unflinching resolve. "No, Ronnie," she said, her tone sharp and cutting. "You betrayed yourself the moment you thought you could drag my family into your filth. You lied. You schemed. You thought you could outwit me. And you failed." Every word was a blade, slicing through the thin veil of power he had clung to. Ronnie lunged, his fury exploding into desperation, but Sonny's men restrained him before he could get close. His shouts filled the air, curses and threats hurled with the last shreds of his defiance. "This isn't over. You'll regret this, Tracy. I'll make you pay." The officer snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, dragging him back, his voice echoing across the docks. Tracy stood firm, unshaken, her posture regal and unmovable. She had faced down Ronnie's terrible secret, and she had won. Later, when the dust settled and the city began buzzing with rumors of Ronnie's arrest, Tracy returned to the Quartermaine mansion. She stood in the foyer for a long moment, breathing in the quiet, taking stock of what she had risked and what she had saved. The house looked the same, but everything felt different. Ronnie's shadow had been lifted, his deceit stripped away, and the Quartermaine name remained intact. It wasn't without cost, her nerves still hummed from the danger, her heart heavier from the burden of secrecy she had carried, but victory was hers. Sonny stopped by before the night ended, lingering in the doorway of the study as Tracy poured herself a well-deserved drink. His expression was unreadable, but there was respect in his voice when he spoke. "You've got more steel in you than most people I know," he admitted. Tracy didn't look up as she swirled her glass, her smirk subtle but unmistakable. "Don't sound so surprised, Sonny. I've been underestimated my whole life. And every single time, it's been someone else's mistake." He chuckled softly, shaking his head before leaving her in peace. Alone once more, Tracy lifted her glass in a solitary toast. To survival. To victory. To the knowledge that no secret, no matter how terrible, could withstand her determination. Ronnie's downfall was complete, but in Port Charles, one battle always gave way to another.